The pandemic could trigger a migrant crisis from poorer nations, larger than that caused by the Syrian war. That's the warning of one international aid group. We'll hear from them ahead. And from the Foreign Minister of Norway, arguing for a global response. First, Paul Adams reports on how less developed nations are coping.
The virus, we keep being told, does not discriminate. But as Europe and America wrestle with the human and economic cost of this pandemic, it's important to look further afield. If we, the most developed countries on Earth, struggle to cope with our sophisticated healthcare systems and vast resources, how will less fortunate nations fare? As we look after ourselves, can we afford to ignore others? No, said the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres last month.
If you let the virus spread like wildfire, especially in the most vulnerable regions of the world, it would kill millions of people. The health catastrophe makes clear that we are only as strong as the weakest health system. Global solidarity is not only a moral imperative, it is in everyone's interests.
From their balconies, Indians pledged to beat the virus. But this vast nation of 1.3 billion people is in lockdown, and it's causing terrible economic damage. As cities shut down, hundreds of thousands of suddenly unemployed migrant workers started trudging back to their villages, the biggest mass migration since partition. Police instructions to maintain social distancing on their long walk seemed merely to add insult to injury. But Indians weren't the only people on the move. When the virus took hold in Iran a month ago, tens of thousands of Afghan refugees fled back across the border. In Kabul, where municipal workers in hazmat suits sprayed the streets with disinfectant, anxious government officials said the returnees were bringing the virus with them. Not only that, but they were leaving behind jobs that for years had helped to sustain families back home. All over the world, remittances keep millions of people out of total poverty, and they're drying up. Ethiopia's First Lady, Zinash Tayechu, is praying for mercy. This song, released on Tuesday, asks God not to abandon her people. Her husband, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, says if the virus is not defeated in Africa, it will bounce back elsewhere. From the slums of Lagos to the refugee camps of Uganda, the continent is home to some of the most crowded places on Earth. Social distancing is almost unthinkable, whatever measures governments try to put in place.
Based on the advice of the Federal Ministry of Health, I am directing the cessation of all movements in Lagos and the FCT.
Africa has some advantages. Its population is younger. The experience of Ebola has taught some countries useful lessons in surveillance and rapid response. But the advantages only go so far. Overcrowding, the lack of access to soap and water, and desperate shortages of vital medical equipment — Mali has just 3 ventilators per million people — mean that Africa's health systems could be overwhelmed. Speaking this week to the BBC World Service, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, said developing countries were in danger of facing the crisis alone.
I see this pandemic response to date having been largely one of each country trying to save its own skin. We have poor and vulnerable countries which really desperately need support both for the health response and for the economic response, and they're not getting it.
A farmer in India feeds strawberries to his cows. He no longer has any way of getting his valuable crop to market. In Kenya, flower farms which depend on exports to Europe are laying off thousands of workers. The UN has warned that half the jobs in Africa could be lost. Across the developing world, this pandemic's potential to wreak havoc is vast, and that's something that ought to alarm everyone.
Paul Adams reporting. Mukhtar Karim is CEO of Lady Fatima Trust, a charity offering aid in developing countries. He says that the virus could trigger a migrant crisis, even bigger than that caused by the Syrian civil war.
As a developed nation, if we are struggling to contain the pandemic, and it's taken us as long as it has to react and put together the resources, there are lots of war-ravaged countries or countries affected by famine, that are far worse placed to be able to deal with this crisis, and therefore I can foresee there being large potential for migrants wanting to flee those areas should COVID spread more rapidly there. I see this as an opportunity for us to look at what sort of situations people go through on a daily basis, and how as on the humanitarian front we can utilize the opportunity that we have here, both to create a good and robust healthcare system down to basic sanitation, and also create sustainable jobs at all levels.